may be seated.
What's in a name? Shakespeare famously said that a rose is still a rose, right? What did he say? He said a rose by any other name is still a rose. Not too up on my Shakespeare, obviously. A rose by any other name is still a rose, which would suggest that names really don't matter a lot. After all, names are just letters put together. They're just symbols. But you and I know that our names are important because behind every symbol there is meaning. Something that does stand for something else. Something that does matter. I've told some of you this story, but I know an ER doctor, and one day he went into the examining room to see a patient, and he got the chart from outside the door, and he looked at the name, and the name was spelled K-M-N-O-P. He had no idea what the name was. He didn't know how to pronounce that, K-M-N-O-P. And so he walked into the room, and he met the young lady, and he said hello, and he said, "How do you pronounce your name?" And she said, "Noel." It took me a while too. Do you get it? It's alphabet. K-M-N-O-P. There's no L. Her name was Noel. I'm not making this up. This is true. Some of you still don't get it. It's okay. You're going to be taking a nap this afternoon, and you're just going to wake up, and the light bulb will go off. I read about a couple in New York City that petitioned the city to change the name of their 4-year-old son, and this is the name they want to name their son. Listen to this. Yo, Zing, Hayno, Augustus, Eisner, Alexander, Weisner, Knuckles, Jeremenjenko, Conley. 10 names. They even let the 4-year-old pick 2 of the names. One of the names he picked was Knuckles, which was the name of his father's childhood dog. Can you believe that God put us in charge of this planet? Sometimes I'm just not sure if that was a good choice. But the father said, he explained it this way, he said, there's reasons for these names, every one of them. We wanted to honor our ancestors, and, he said, we want to give pushback to social norms and expectations. You see, names do mean something. Names do matter. You can ask anyone who's about to have a child. Some of you remember this. Ask anyone who's about to have a child if names matter, because they're going through that task of choosing a name for that child. Some of you remember that. You get the books with all the names. You look on the internet. What are the most popular names? You think about family names. Names do, in fact, matter. And so today, I want us to talk about 2 different names and the identities behind those names. And hopefully by the end, we will also learn something about ourselves, something about our identities, who we are, who God made us to be. We're in a series right now called Undeniable. We're looking at different scenes in the life of Simon Peter as we read in the Gospels and in the book of Acts. We know that Jesus called him to leave his fishing nets behind so that Jesus could make him a fisher of people. We also know that Jesus often rebuked him. He often got on to Peter because he didn't always have spiritual vision. Sometimes he just acted and said things that didn't show a lot of faith. Sometimes he was impulsive. Sometimes he stuck his foot in his mouth. And so we know that Jesus often rebuked him. His given name was Simon. But as the Gospel of John opens up, we read something, a very important detail, as we're introduced to Simon. His brother Andrew brings him to Jesus, and this is what happens. John chapter 1, verse 42. He brought him to Jesus. Jesus looked at him and said, "You are Simon, son of John, or Jonah, or even Jonas." It's all the same thing. "You are Simon, son of John. You will be called Cephas," which, when translated, is Peter. Cephas is Aramaic. Peter is the Greek from Petros. Petros, as you may know, means stone or rock. And so Jesus changes Simon's name to Petros or Peter, Cephas, which means stone or rock. Now, when you think about Peter, maybe you know a lot about him, maybe you don't know very much, but I can tell you he often did not act like someone who you would call rock, stone. He's not necessarily someone who was stable, someone who was dependable, responsible. And yet, sometimes it's important for us to see who we can be, who we should be, who God has made us to be. And I believe that as Jesus changes his name from Simon to Petros, or Peter, rock, stone, that Jesus is saying to him, Peter, this is who I see you as. This is who you can be. This, in fact, is who you are. It's interesting when you look at the Gospels, especially Matthew, Mark, and Luke. John MacArthur makes this point. He said, when you look at those three Gospels, unless it's a logistical detail about something Peter is doing, when Peter does something or says something that is rash or reckless, he's often referred to as Simon, his old name. But when he does something that just seems to be right on target, when he acts and speaks from the center of God's will, he's often referred to as Peter, the rock. So maybe names do matter. But before Peter can really know who he is, he must know something else. Just like you and I, before we can really know who we are, we need to know who is behind another name. We need to know who Jesus is. Who is Jesus? Think for a minute about how many books have been written addressing this question. Think about the number of debates and conversations and blogs and posts and articles, and so many things have been written and said addressing this question. It is a question that has both blessed and, in many ways, bothered our world for 20 centuries. Who is Jesus? He is known by many names and titles. He is Emmanuel, God with us. He is the Word, the Anointed One. He is Christ. That is not his last name. Jesus Christ. That's not his last name. He is Messiah. He is Lord of Lords. He is Redeemer. There's so many names and titles, but who is behind all of those names and titles? That's the question he asked his followers one day. The story is recorded in Matthew chapter 16. Starting in verse 13, when Jesus came to the region of Caesarea Philippi, he asked his disciples, "Who do people say the Son of Man is?" Jesus says to them, "What's the word on the streets? What are people saying about me? Who do they say I am?" Now keep in mind, by this time, people are beginning to know who he is, or at least they know who they think he is. They've seen him do miracles. They've heard him speak and preach and teach with authority. Crowds are gathering. And so Jesus wants to know, what are people saying? Who do they think I am? And I want you to realize that Jesus is not asking this question because he's worried about his public persona. He's not concerned about the optics of his image out in the marketplace, as though he's running a campaign. No, this isn't a public relations campaign, and he's not fishing for a compliment. It's almost what it seems like, right? I mean, if you or I ask that question, hey, what are people saying about me? I mean, it's like you're fishing for a compliment, or at least you want to know what people are saying, so if there's something negative, you can do something different so they feel more positive, right? Go on social media, see how many followers I have, see if someone has liked something. That's not what Jesus is doing. He's not fishing for a compliment. This conversation is not intended to inflate his ego. In fact, when you look at it in the context, what we see is something much deeper happening here. This question, this conversation is about who Jesus is so that we can know who we are. And so Jesus asked them, "Who do people say that I am?" Notice their answer in verse 14. They say, "Well, some say John the Baptist, some say Elijah, others are saying that's Jeremiah or one of the prophets." It seems pretty clear that the general perception of Jesus is that he is a mouthpiece for God, a spokesperson for God, maybe even a fiery prophet like Elijah or John the Baptist. You see, the people don't really know what to do with Jesus. The world likes to put labels on people, doesn't it? We have probably been the subject of that or the victim of that, and unfortunately, many times we also do that. We put labels on people. For Jesus, they didn't know what label to put on him because he was so different. They knew he was special. He was doing these miracles. He was speaking with authority. But we don't really know who he is. He must be a prophet. Clearly, at the very least, he is a prophet. He is a spokesperson for God. And then notice what Jesus does. He turns to his apostles and he makes the conversation very personal. And Jesus asked them the question that every single person in the world has to answer. It is the question that determines who we are, how we live, and where we spend eternity. This is the question you cannot avoid. To avoid this question is to answer it incorrectly. It is the question that the church should take to the world. You know the question. He turns to them in verse 15 and says, "What about you? Who do you say I am?" Okay, the crowd thinks I'm a prophet, maybe like Elijah, maybe John the Baptist. What about you? Who do you say that I am? And it's interesting, when you look at this question and how it's worded in the English translation, it sounds almost like an open-ended question, doesn't it? Like it's a relative question. Who do you say I am? You know, students will tell you they either love or hate essay questions, right? You either love or hate essay questions. Students who love essay questions view them as, these are very subjective. That means there are multiple correct answers. If I just write enough and ramble enough and throw in a few key words, I'll get some credit. Maybe partial credit, but I'll get some credit. But there are other students who, they do not like essay questions. They want definitive answers. True, false, multiple choice, right? No subjectivity at all. When you read this, especially in the English translation, you think, okay, is this one of those questions where you just have to put something down on paper because there's really no wrong answer? When Jesus says, "Who do you say I am?" is he saying your answer can be different than your answer? And your answer can be different than your answer, and we can all answer differently because we get to determine who Jesus is. It's like the story of the Bible class where all the kids were coloring at the table and the teacher was walking around and she noticed one of the little girls just sketching feverishly. And she said, "Oh, what are you drawing there? What are you coloring?" The little girl said, I'm coloring a picture of Jesus. I'm drawing a picture of Jesus." And the teacher said, "Oh, that's great." She said, "Now you do know that no one really knows what Jesus looks like, right?" And she said, the little girl said, "They will in a minute." Is that what Jesus is doing here? No. Jesus isn't saying we get to determine who he is. That's a very important point to make because so many people in the world today think that that's the case. And however they choose to draw Jesus, it shapes how they view Jesus and how they interact with Jesus. As though I can answer that open-ended question however I want to, and then that determines the terms for how I interact with him and how I live my life in light of who he is. There is a definitive answer to Jesus' question about his identity. Jesus isn't who he is because we think he is. But who we think he is extremely important. You following me? Jesus doesn't adjust to our perceptions of him. We form our perceptions based on who he is. And so Jesus asks his closest friends and followers about his identity. Who do you say I am? And who do you think speaks up first? That's right. Before the other guys even have time to process the question, Peter blurts out the answer. Verse 16, Simon Peter answered, "You are the Messiah." Some versions say you are the Christ, the Son of the living God. So often Peter spoke up when he shouldn't have. So often Peter said things that were way off track. But right here, Peter gets it. He is right on target. What a wonderful confession of faith. Peter says, you are the Messiah, the one we've been waiting on. You are the chosen one, the anointed one. You are the Christ. You are the Son of the living God, Yahweh. You are Jesus. From a textual standpoint, scholars agree that this confession, this great confession of faith by Peter, it is the turning point in the gospel story. It is the hinge in the gospel story. That everything leading up to this point is trying to ask and beginning to answer that question, who is Jesus? And after Peter says, you are the Christ, the Son of the living God, after that is out there and established, now everything begins to funnel to the cross. It is the fulcrum. It is the hinge in the gospel story. But it's not just the fulcrum. It is the foundation for everything we are and everything we do. Notice how Jesus responds to Peter. Verse 17, Jesus replied, "Blessed are you, Simon, son of Jonah, for this was not revealed to you by flesh and blood, but by my Father in heaven. And I tell you that you are Peter, you are Petros, and on this rock I will build my church. And the gates of Hades," the realm of the dead is what that means, the realm of the dead, the gates of Hades will not overcome it. Before we talk about Jesus' identity here, don't miss this important point. I don't know about you, but sometimes when I watch the news or I go online and I see what's happening in our world, I get discouraged. And sometimes when I hear about the decline of the church, I get discouraged. And sometimes when I look out there and I just see so much evil in our world, I get discouraged. But notice what Jesus says. He says, no matter what is happening, no matter how much evil there is in the world, no matter who is in charge of this country or any other country, no matter how much conflict is happening in our world, the gates of hell, the power of the dead, will not, cannot, absolutely will never overcome and prevail against the Lord's church. That is so important for us to remember. It's so important for us to remember. So Peter answers Jesus' question. And Jesus affirms Peter, and you can literally see the transition that takes place. Did you see it? He begins, Jesus does, by calling him Simon, but he ends by calling him Peter, Petros. In this conversation about who Jesus is, about Jesus' identity, Jesus does something remarkable. He talks about who Peter is. He talks about his identity. Jesus says, I see you as, and I call you to be a rock, a solid foundation, someone who is reliable and dependable and consistent, someone through whom God can do great things. You see, it's on that wonderful, timeless, enduring, undeniable truth that Peter declares that Jesus is the Christ, the Son of the living God. It is on that truth that Jesus built his church. And let me share a little insight with you that might change a little bit how you view what Jesus says here, and maybe even in other places, what Jesus says and what is said about Jesus. What do we commonly think of as Jesus' profession, at least before his public ministry? He grew up in his father's house. His father was a carpenter, and we assume Jesus was a carpenter. It's interesting, when you look at the Greek there, that word that is translated in the English as carpenter is actually tekton. And it means craftsman or builder. And so somewhere along the way, English translators just sort of labeled that as a carpenter. But when you look at where Jesus lived, you soon realize there's not a lot of lumber. There aren't that many trees. In fact, most of the wood, most of the lumber had to be imported in, maybe from Lebanon or somewhere else. There's a good chance, especially when you consider how houses and buildings were built back then, there's a good chance that Jesus, as a craftsman, as a builder, was a stonemason. Houses were often built by stacking stones or carving stones. Why is that significant? Well, it may not be. But if you think about it, if that is the case, then what he did gives significance to what he said. So here in Matthew 16, when Jesus tells Peter that his name is what? Rock, stone, and that Jesus is going to do what? He is going to build his church on that great confession, on Jesus' identity as the Son of the living God, the Christ. It makes perfect sense. Jesus is building something out of these living stones, with he himself as the chief cornerstone. And sure enough, what do we see in Acts chapter 2? Peter stands up in front of the crowd, inspired by the Holy Spirit, and he preaches. What does he preach to them? That Jesus is the Christ, and they crucified him. And the people are cut to the heart, and they respond by repenting and being baptized. The church is born, and the rest is history, right? Here's what you need to know. To truly know who you are, you need to know who Jesus is. If you're searching for who am I, what am I supposed to be doing, what is my identity, what is my purpose, before you can answer those questions, you need to know who Jesus is. Because how you answer that question about Jesus shapes who you are, how you see yourself and your purpose. It informs your identity. It is pretty much an undisputed fact that Jesus was a historical figure that lived about 2,000 years ago on this earth. But how do you view him? How do you see him? Some people, they see Jesus as just a good teacher, like a philosopher among other good philosophers. And if that's the case, that informs how you see yourself and how you live your life. And you may adopt some of Jesus' teachings, and you may say, yeah, he really made a lot of sense with the way he said to treat people and what to do. And so you may adopt some of those teachings, but there will never be transformation. If you simply view Jesus as a moral guide, a moral example, you may hold true to some of his morals. You may hold that moral example up of Jesus for yourself, and especially to a world that maybe you want to challenge now and again. But will you ever make him Lord of your life? If you see Jesus only as a friend, Jesus is my best friend, he's my buddy, then probably you will extract nice, warm feelings about Jesus. But there's a great chance that cross-carrying discipleship will never be a part of your life. You see, to really know who you are, you need to know who Jesus is. You need to answer that question that Jesus asked his followers years ago. Who do you say I am? And when we can answer that question like Peter did, you are the Christ, the Son of the living God, and you allow that great confession, that timeless truth, to shape your thinking and your life, to order your values and your priorities, God brings about transformation. God does in your life what He did in Peter's life. And He can use you to do great things. He can build something in you and use you to build something great in this world. Many of you probably remember that movie Lion King from 1994. I can't believe it's been that long ago. I heard they're actually making an updated version this summer with computer animation. But if you've seen that movie, most parents have seen it many, many times. If you've seen that movie, you remember this one scene where Simba, he is the lion cub of the fallen king, he's sort of losing himself. He's sort of lost himself, and he runs away. And there's this point in time when he stops and he looks into some water and he sees the reflection of his face, and then suddenly something magical happens. The reflection of his face changes into the reflection of his father's face, Mufasa. And he hears this voice, Simba? Father? And his father says, Simba, you have forgotten me. And Simba says, no, how could I do that? And his father says, you have forgotten who you are. And so you have forgotten me. Take a look at yourself. You are so much more than what you have become. And Simba says, well, how do I go back? I'm not who I was. And his father says to him, remember who you are. You are my son and the one true king, his father says. Remember who you are. What a great scene. There's so much truth beneath that scene. Because so often in life we lose ourselves. We simply forget who we are. There's all these voices in the world saying, this is who you are. This is who you should be. There's voices inside us saying, be true to yourself. And I'm like, I don't know who myself is. Well, this is who you are. And so often those voices are telling us that we are someone that God did not create us to be. And we forget who we are. And when we forget who we are, we forget who He is. And our Father, all the while, is saying to us, remember who you are. Remember who you are. You are my child. You are the son or daughter of the King. Remember who you are. Jesus told Peter who he was. He said, you are a rock. Interesting, later in his life, Peter would write in 1 Peter chapter 2 these words. And I wonder, as he wrote these words, if maybe he wasn't reflecting back on this day, Matthew 16, when he made that great confession. Or maybe he was thinking back when Jesus actually changed his name to Petros. 1 Peter chapter 2, Peter says, as you come to him, the living stone, rejected by humans, but chosen by God, and precious. I love that. Precious to him. You too, like living stones, are being built to a spiritual house, to a holy priesthood, offering spiritual sacrifices acceptable to God through Jesus Christ. Peter says, don't forget who you are. Because who you are as living stones is directly related to who He is, the living stone. Rejected by so many people, but chosen by God and precious to Him. Just as you are chosen by God and precious to Him. When you come to Christ, He gives you a new name. the name that you were always intended to wear, His name. You become a living stone through which God does great things. God is building something significant. So don't forget who you are. Remember who you are. To truly know who you are, you need to know who Jesus is. And so I leave you with the question that Jesus asked his followers that day. Who do you say Jesus is? Who do you say the Son of Man is? Who is He? Because how you answer that question dictates how you live your life and who you are, how you see yourself. Maybe today you're ready to make the same confession Peter made. Well, I know who Jesus is. He is the Christ. I believe He is the Son of the living God, and you're ready to be clothed with Christ in baptism, living your life for Him. We would be honored to celebrate that choice with you. Maybe we can encourage you today and pray for you. We're going to stand and sing a song. We'll have a couple of shepherds and their wives in the parlor, a room right behind me. You can make your way through any of the exits and go there, and they would be happy to receive you and encourage you and pray for you. Or obviously, you can come down to the front, and together we'll lift you up to God. We can serve you in any way. We invite you to